The module essentially is not a middleware, which means it doesn't sit outside your system. It sits within your NAV system, NAV environment. So what I mean by that is it essentially becomes a part of your NAV system. We built this in collaboration with SAP Concur. So they've tested it with us and certified it, and that's how we're published on their App Center. So there is a bit of setup that we do while we implement, and I'll show you a few elements of the setup. So that's essentially the setup which we go through with you when we're doing the implementation. There are quite a few options. For example, if you want to download the images from Concur into Business Central, what's your LTY local currency code, because we can handle multiple currencies and exchange rates if needed. A few other setups that are involved. So that's one. Then we have users. So this is where we set up your Concur users. They're not necessarily your NAV users. And that's also how we connect or link the Concur user to a NAV vendor. So it can essentially create an invoice or a journal, depending on how you reimburse for out-of-pocket expenses. Okay. Users, then we have expense types. So expense types is essentially a mapping tool or a mapping page where you can say in Concur, if the expense type says car, then it goes into a different GL account in Business Central. What this does is it gives you flexibility to break down your expenses on the Concur side, but in NAV, it'll still post to the same account. So what I mean by that is if you look at these, that's essentially going into the same GL account in NAV. However, in Business Central, in Concur, it could say fuel and other parking and travel expenses. So that's the benefit of using the expense types. I'll also show you what the expense reports look like when they come into NAV. So this is a list of all the expense reports that are in NAV at this point. And if we open one of those, it essentially mimics your kind of an invoice document or a purchase invoice or a sales invoice. So there is a header section and then there is lines. On the header, that number gets generated automatically when the expense reports are pulled in from Concur. The employee ID, which is used to map to the vendor for out-of-pocket expenses. We bring in the expense types, we bring in the currency codes, we bring in the account codes, the amount that was entered in the expense report. We also bring in credit card information. If it is a credit card expense that needs to be paid off to the credit card company, we bring in the dimensions. So that's a dimension that is set up in Concur and it's mapped to an expense report. When we click on post, depending on how the system is set up, it can create purchase invoice or just journals, however we want to process the expense to the ledgers. Okay, so that's good. And we move on. So what I'm going to do is there is also a on-demand download. So the connector essentially works on a scheduler, job queues, which are standard in NAV. And you can schedule it to run every day, 7 p.m. or every Friday, 7 p.m., 8 p.m., whichever time suits, depending on how the approvals are conducted. And it will essentially keep running in the background and bringing expense reports into the system. You can also do an on-demand download by clicking on Retrieve Expense Reports. So if there is something which has got to be processed right away, you can click on that, and then it takes about 2 to 5 minutes to bring you the expense reports into the list here. All right, and let's move on. So what I will do to show you the process is I'll go to Concur. This is Concur Sandbox, our sandbox, where we work for any development or enhancements that we have to add to the module. So let's start with expense reports. So I'll go ahead and create an expense report. And this time travel to California, for instance. Conference. And let's go create. You can create expense reports via web or via cell phone, whichever, doesn't matter. The end goal is that it will come into NAV. So I'll pick expenses that I want to enter here, and I'll also attach some receipts. So that's for parking. Let's pick a parking receipt here. And that I'm just going to enter a random amount for now. It might not match the receipt. I can't see the image correctly. So parking, and I will pick a dimension here for sales and save the expense. I'll add another one. Let's go with taxi. And I'll pick a receipt again. So taxi Uber. And that is 43.83. So 43.83. Again, I'll pick a dimension here. So save the expenses. Now, in your environment, in your Concur environment, there might be approvals that are required. And when you submit the expense report, it'll essentially route for approvals. Over here in the sandbox, we don't have any approvals, so it'll just get submitted and approved at the same time. So it's 53.83. The description is travel to California, and I'm going to submit that. There we go. All right, so that's submitted. Now, there are two ways to bring the expense report into the system. One is clicking on that, or we can use the job queue entries. So we'll do it with the job queues. These are the two job queues that are required. The integration one is the one that brings the expenses from Concur, and the other one is to use to create the expense reports. So I'll set that to ready, and it'll essentially execute. So there it says in process, and it is essentially going to Concur, checking for any approved expenses that are available to download, and it is bringing in all the data or information for the expense reports into NAV. And there we go, that's completed. So we'll set it on hold. Not a problem. So as I mentioned, this is this job queues, which is standard, and it can be set up to run however you want, whatever like recurring way. So this is kind of the setup to run. So I've set the interval to 2 minutes just because I wanted to download constantly if there are any expense reports, but you can set it to run every day at 7 p.m. as I mentioned earlier, and you can also choose on what day you want to run it. So let's say your approvals happen every Friday. So you could run it at 7 or 8 p.m. every Friday, and then the creation can run on Saturday. So when you come in on Monday, your expense reports are in the system. Okay. And then the next one that we have to run is that. So these are subsequently scheduled. And once that finishes, this one executes. So I'll execute that one. And this one is pretty quick. It's just going through the data and creating the expense reports. So I'll put that back on hold. And we'll go into expense reports. And if I sort it ascending, that is the new one, 115, travel to California, 53.83 was the amount that we entered. And yep, so there's the expense types, again, account codes, the amounts, the information for the dimensions is right here. If it was a credit card expense, then we would have also received the credit card account number over here. And past that, you essentially click post, and it'll either create a journal or an invoice, depending on how it is set up.